Hi guys, Mr. Ridgway here. Hope you guys are having a really good day. I know I'm not there today, actually for the first time, which kind of feels weird. My son was born this morning, which feels awesome and amazing. Because I got a free moment here, I kind of went home to basically sleep for the first time that I haven't in 3 days. I thought I might take you guys through this lesson. On YouTube, as well as walk you through the mini lesson for how the Cold War gets wrapped up. But Reagan is on the docket for today, or as Ted Cruz, Rick Perry calls him Ronald Raven. So that's what we're doing. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at is the rise of Ronald Reagan and Republican conservatism, and talk about how we get kind of our modern day conservatives, so to speak. And then we're also going to look at kind of some different contrasts that are there in American society while Reagan is in power. And then we're going to look at what does the United States do at the end of the Cold War, and then also kind of what happens to the Soviet Union when it collapses. Okay? So the rise of Reagan and the resurgence of conservatism. You will need to watch this one on your own, okay? I cannot take you through this because simply YouTube will cause, or will say that I did copyright infringement. So click that button when you're ready. And then, once you've done so, just move along with me. So if you need to pause this video right now, totally fine. Go ahead and do so. Okay. The rise of Reagan and conservatism. So really, the question is, how did conservative society and Reagan come to dominate the political and social landscape of the 1980s? If you don't know anything about Ronald Reagan, the guy today for the Republican Party is kind of like the man, the myth, and the legend. Like, he is the bee's knees of, if you were a diehard conservative, you kind of worship the idol of Ronald Reagan. And so we're going to look at kind of how he comes to power, and kind of what forces help kind of propel him there, as well as what he did himself. To answer this question, what you'll be doing is putting together a picture of causes by picking a piece of one of those puzzles and then teaching it to your classmates, okay? And yes, I would, even though I'm not there, I would like you to kind of master one part and then go teach other people, because not only is some of the information similar to what you'll find with others, but it's kind of different too, and you'll find that kind of your understanding when you work with other people is kind of shaped by their own similar but yet different understanding. Okay, so what'll happen is you'll work on your part. You'll basically summarize your part inside your puzzle piece, okay, and then you'll go find other people and help them complete their puzzle by teaching them the information that you now know. Okay, so the worksheet looks a little bit ridiculous, but since it is the myth of Ronald Reagan, it is going to look like this. It's the best, most ridiculous picture of Ronald Reagan that I could find, which is Ronald Reagan riding a velociraptor into combat. Now, I know it doesn't look like it here, okay, but these are what the puzzle pieces look like, okay? So, and this is where you'll do your writing in. If you want to do this digitally, electronically, okay, because again, I'm not there. I think I do have the papers there on the bookshelf. All you have to do is just double click on this guy, and you can drop in a text box and type away, okay? So that shouldn't be too difficult to do. Now, if you want to see what the picture looks like, here it is, okay? So you click any puzzle piece to be your first puzzle piece that you would like to start with, okay? Again, another copy of the worksheet is right here, so this isn't actually a piece right here, but all these pieces of the puzzle of Ronald Reagan riding a velociraptor is available, and they all give kind of different insights into the forces that kind of help propel Ronald Reagan to the presidency, and then kind of what he himself did to get himself there, okay? So, go ahead and pause the video here, knock this guy out. It shouldn't take you too long to look at your own source, but it will take you certainly longer to talk to everybody else in the room to get 4, 5, 6, 7 of the pieces complete, okay, or the other 6, because you'll do one. Alrighty, so moving on. We have a second jigsaw. What are the contrasts present in the American society and economy in the 1980s? And it's really this world of some very vivid contrasts. And so it's called Two Pictures of the 1980s, and we have kind of two different very, very easy puzzles that you kind of look at here. Again, you're doing the same thing. you're going to learn one part from one of the puzzles. Doesn't matter which of the two puzzles you pick. And then once you learn about it, you'll teach it to your classmates, and then you'll, just go ahead and repeat until you've got all your pieces done. Okay. The worksheet here looks a little bit different, just because it is on a different topic. And so what we have is our second jigsaw. Again, it works the exact same way. You just click, and we can edit and drop in text boxes as we would like. Okay, so 2 pictures of the 1980s. And so, what does this actually look like? So we have in the 1980s, when we talk about the economy and society, we really have a very struggling part of people's lives, and it's over on this side for you guys, that really defines that age. When conservative forces really get kicking into the White House and in society, a lot of people aren't invited on that journey to come along, so to speak. And so these puzzle pieces will take you through that. But then on the other hand, the 1980s has a lot of the wealthier parts of society getting much, much more wealthy compared to the rest. And so that's what this puzzle on the right-hand side, right above my head, is dedicated to looking at. Okay, if we all kind of briefly take you through an example of one of these puzzles. So over here, it looks like the victims of AIDS. Okay, the one that I made you explain a little bit here is this one is on what it was like to live in 1980 in New York. Okay, so you scroll down, you're going to click this View Gallery. So it talks about what New York looked like during the 1980s and what that kind of life in the city was like. And then the last one down here, it talks about basically it's a infographic on what it was like to live as a Black American during Ronald Reagan's presidency. And even though, again, we have this, some people view the 1980s as this really positive view, or as this really positive experience of a rebounding economy since stagflation, it's actually really kind of diverse. And that is certainly one of the less fun sides of it. This one also looks how the rich get richer during Reaganism. Okay, it talks about supply side economics. This one right here is kind of an interesting graph. It shows you how real income kind of changes, and we're looking right here at the 1980s. Okay, so you see there's quite a significant change there. I'll leave it for you to decide how that does change. Okay, and then this is a really cool one. What do 1980 TV shows tell us about kind of what that era was defined by? And so it talks about Seinfeld and Dallas and a few other kind of really interesting shows that can kind of give you a lens into what people thought the 1980s were really all about. Okay, so go ahead, get started here. Okay, and when you're ready to go on, and then we'll talk about what happens at the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, be right back, dog pup. Okay, sorry, just had to answer the phone there real fast. So, America in the end of the Cold War. What is this like? Make sure you get Jamie in the shot so he can be part of the lesson too. This is a really kind of weird mini lesson because the end of the Cold War is long and complicated and kind of difficult to understand. But we're going to do the best we can here. Okay, so how does perception change our understanding of historical events? We'll look at the end of the Cold War from both the U.S. and also very briefly the Soviet Union's perspective. And then also, how do we create heroes and villains like Ronald Reagan, who conservatives generally today think of in very kind of high terms. Okay, so how do we create these people in terms of our kind of national character? Now, it says the end of the Cold War, two tales. We're going to look very specifically at the perspective of the United States because simply this is U.S. history, but we will get to this a little bit later, okay? And I'll kind of mention this in brief when the time comes for it, okay? So what the end of the Cold War from the perspective of the United States. Okay, so recall from last lesson, I hope that you got that the United States policy of containment changed under Nixon, and that was détente, which is that lessening of tension. okay, by playing communist China and the Soviet Union off of each other. Both want to try to be the best friends of the United States. Okay, now, what does Reagan do when he takes office that's going to help lead to the end of the Cold War? Well, the other thing you still need to know is that even though detente has happened under Nixon, the US and the Soviet Union still have tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. And what Reagan's going to do is not only just approach the Cold War through detente, he's also going to try to kind of change the United States' approach away from that as well. So he's kind of doing two things at the same time. We'll kind of show how this is the case. Okay? So, on one hand, Reagan hated communism, and he really does campaign hard against it. He calls it the evil empire. He says that the Soviets are prepared to commit any crime anywhere, to lie, to cheat in order to achieve their ends. So what does Reagan do? This is not very detente-like. He authorizes a massive increase in military spending for nuclear and conventional weapons. So again, we're kind of changing course from the Nixon détente policy. He also, on this kind of theme, he really escalates the nuclear arms race. So as the United States ramps up its military spending, it starts to build more nuclear weapons. Now, some of these plans are just, straight up kind of like nuclear warheads that we still have around today, but there's even more kind of like ridiculous plans out there. The one that gets probably the most focus is something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or the SDI, which Reagan proposed building a space station, yes, a space station, and putting lasers on it to shoot down missiles. Now, it was jokingly called Star Wars back then, which is the most coincidentally funny thing that I'm bringing up on May the 4th when my son is now born. But, man, that feels weird to say. But that's what it was called, because it was like, back then for the 1980s, like, this is the most ridiculous idea that Reagan's going to possibly do. We're going to build a space station, we're going to put lasers on it to shoot down nukes. This, even though billions of dollars was put into it, it never actually worked. Now, what does this mean for the Cold War? Well, it's extremely expensive for the United States, and the United States runs up some gigantic budget deficits due to this. Reagan will actually triple the national deficit during this time, just by doing this, along with cutting taxes. However, what it does do is it forces the Soviet Union to start spending as much money to keep up with the United States, and the Soviet economy simply cannot keep up with basically the effort that it would take to keep match with both technology and number of armaments of the US. And so perhaps this does, some historians have speculated that this does lead to economic instability inside the Soviet Union, okay? So the question is, like, does Reagan deserve to be a hero then? Because what we do know, as you'll find out, is that the Soviet Union kind of collapses on itself. And perhaps, maybe some of that is due to the economics that Reagan pushed. Or rather, the military spending that Reagan pushed onto the Soviets, which they had to match. I don't know. There's certainly the people out there who believe that is the perspective. I think there's not only that, but I think, Reagan does deserve credit, but I think it also is due to some things inside the Soviet Union, which we'll take a look at here a little later. Now, what else does Reagan do in the Soviet with the Soviets and after, or as we get towards the end of the Cold War? Well, if he defies detente on one side, he also, though, kind of does contradict that policy a few different ways, in a few other respects, okay? Now, if he deserves the title of being the person who ends the Cold War and defeats communism, Reagan does try to, I don't want to say necessarily placate the Soviets, but certainly tries to lessen tension with them and thereby kind of not knock them out. And probably the most famous way he does this is the SALT talks. And so he signs what is the second of two major, nuclear stockpile reduction treaties that it's called, Strategic Arms and Limitation Talks, or SALT. And this is a sign of detente and cooperation with the Soviet Union. Now, it only does reduce, nuclear stockpiles of both sides by 4%, okay? But Reagan, by doing this, He does allow the Soviet Union perhaps to live on a little bit longer because by not having to keep as many nukes around, they don't have to spend as much money. And the Soviet Union is more than happy to spend their money on domestic issues and problems that they're having on the economic kind of home front. Now, if Reagan also should deserve the title of hero, we have to think about what's also going on during the Soviet Union during the end of the Cold War. Okay, so let's go take a very brief kind of gander at that. You don't need to take notes on this. Okay, and I did put these in here just in case you were so interested. Not going to be on the test, but it'll kind of help you understand. So what's going on in the Soviet Union during this time? Well, the cost of military spending, again, we can probably blame some of that on Reagan and what he forced them to do. But there's also a whole bunch of other things that caused really the Soviet Union to collapse eventually. Some of it's even people have proposed as an ecological answer or thesis that basically the Soviet Union was running, like its foodstuffs could not simply keep pace to keep the country, functioning under communism. So 50% of farms are actually considered to be endangered by the 1980s. But then also the Soviet policy of collectivization, where you combine like these 4 farms into one farm to improve their efficiency, really did end up in some very nasty results and some famines and things like that. Now, when Mikhail Gorbachev takes power in 1985, okay, he does begin to reform the Soviet system. So again, we're looking at from the Soviet Union perspective here. But what Gorbachev does is he likely sets the final stage for the Soviet Union to collapse. And so what he does is he promotes 2 policies. One is called glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means restructuring of the economy. Now, simply what these are, okay, is these are basically making the Soviet Union more Western. So using Western management techniques for openness, you basically allow in glasnost, you basically allow like even some limited criticism to be done of the government and of different businesses. And then perestroika, which is restructuring, means that you actually start to privatize some of the economy, which is the exact opposite of communism. However, both of these efforts are very tiny, but because they're small doesn't mean they should be minimized. Because basically what happens is that as Gorbachev kind of like opens up like just the floodgates just a little bit on this gigantic dam of problems that the Soviet Union has, the dam just bursts. And so this limited freedom that the Soviets, that Gorbachev gave some of the Soviet Union kind of really just explodes. And you see all of these former Soviet states begin to push for independence and democracy. I mean, this is Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and eventually you get things like the Berlin Wall coming down. And so really what happens is glasnost and perestroika, along with some of those problems I mentioned before, the ecological issues, the USSR just kind of falls apart and it dissolves. And that's why there's no USSR today, even though there is still Russia, which was one of its republics. So then I guess a larger kind of couple questions from that are, did containment work? Like, what the United States was doing from the get-go? Was it détente that did it? Or was it Reagan's kind of like détente-ish and not détente-ish policies? I don't know. And that's kind of where, like, if we look at all these problems inside the Soviet Union, and we look at what Reagan did himself, does he cause the end of the Cold War? Probably not, but he likely, through military spending as well as some of his other actions, certainly going after communism more heavily, probably accelerated the possible collapse of the already struggling USSR. Really, he kind of just pushes it, or at least helps accelerate its push over the edge, which it was kind of already flirting with. And then certainly Gorbachev is the one, by just like giving it that little bitty shove of glasnost and perestroika, really just kind of like makes it fall all the way off the cliff. So again, these are really complicated things, and there's lots of really kind of vivid debates that even still happen with political scientists and historians today as to whether or not Reagan deserves this kind of like mythology that people have built around him, and this like ultimate communist fighter, who goes around and rides velociraptors. Okay, so yeah, big changes that are going on, and that's the end of the notes here. But again, so the focus that we want to make sure that you're aware of, okay, is that can you summarize what the U.S. does at the end of the Cold War. What does Reagan do? And what happens to the collapse of the Soviet Union? Basically, it collapses. There's your easy answer. Okay. So that's it for this lesson, and I'm gonna leave you guys there. Good luck, with getting these things done. If you have time at the end, make sure you're keeping up with the Hip Hop Revolution um, readings, because we're gonna have a project on that here pretty soon. Okay. So other than that, I will see you guys later. Jamie says see you later, but he's snoring. Bye bye.